started. And I never have figured out how to make that voice turn off. I don't know why they do that. Anyhow, take your Bible and turn to the book of 2 Samuel, and we pick up tonight in chapter 14. If you are taking the class for credit, tonight is the night that your term paper is due. If you need another day or two, let me know, and that can be arranged. Not a problem there. Just didn't want to have term papers coming in at the same time that the final exam was coming in. So, last week we talked about the murder of Amnon by Absalom and talked a good bit about the fact that the strife among David's children had its roots in David's own actions. Particularly, it's traceable back to his adultery with Bathsheba and his murder of Uriah. And God said, here's the penalty. You know, you're never going to have peace among your children, basically. Well, Amnon rapes Tamar, who is Absalom's sister. And then once he's done with her, he's done with her. And Absalom bides his time until he can murder Amnon, which is the penalty for rape under the old law. But it was not his penalty to administer. It was not his right to act as judge, jury, and executioner. He in effect, was acting the role of the avenger of blood. But that by rights was his father's role, not his. So the consequence of that is that at the end of chapter 13, verse 37, Absalom flees. Absalom runs away from Jerusalem, goes to Talmai, to his grandfather, to away from Jerusalem, and stays away. We begin chapter 14 with the statement, Joab knew that the king's heart went out to Absalom. And that's, the King James says was against or was concerned. The various translations render this differently. And the thing about this, on the one hand, David is his father. So his heart goes out to him as a father to a child. He is estranged and grieving over that. But the other side of that coin is that David is the king. He represents law and right in the nation. And his own son has violated that law. And so he has a situation where his own son is a known murderer, just as he has become basically a known adulterer and is guilty of murder himself in the matter of Uriah. And so on the one hand, his heart goes out to Absalom. He misses him. It's his child. On the other hand, he is against Absalom in his official capacity. Absalom is essentially a wanted fugitive. So he's not in a favorable frame of mind where Absalom is concerned. Joab, on the other hand, Joab wants Absalom back. Now, why would Joab want Absalom back? What would be his motive? He sends to Tekoa, brings a cunning woman, in other words, basically a talented actress, to come and spin out this long involved parable, and then ultimately to make the case to David, bring Absalom home. Where is Joab's dog in this fight? What would his motive be? We might even go so far as to just ask, why does he care? Well, let's think a little bit about Joab. Who is Joab? What is his role in the kingdom?
So he's the cousin, right?
Well, he is related.
Is he the captain of the army?
He is also David's de facto chief of staff, general, commander of the army. He is, as we will see, not unlike Abner had been for Saul. Now remember, Abner, after Saul's death, did what?
He was the one that.
There you go, come on.
My mind is fuzzy today. So after his death, was he the one that their bodies or something were
No,
not,
that was the men of Jabesh Gilead.
okay.
But Abner had been Saul's general, Saul's chief of staff, Saul's chief counselor. And it was Abner who propped up Ishbosheth as rival king against David.
Oh,
And all along, what role had Abner tried to play while Saul was king? He was sort of power behind the throne at times, wasn't he?
mouthpiece.
Now, here's Joab, and he has basically the same role in David's kingdom. And Joab is not above trying to play power politics himself. As we'll go on, we'll see him dipping his toes a little deeper into political things. Now, let's just confine ourselves to Joab serving in David's court at this point. Absalom has been gone for quite some time. He's gone for about 3 years. David is mourning the death of his son, mourning the rape of his daughter, mourning the wickedness of his other son, mourning the fact that his son has committed murder, has now gone away and is estranged from him because of this. For 3 years, this has been going on. Do you suppose David's maybe a little bit distracted?
Oh, yeah.
A little bit unfocused in matters of the kingdom?
Yeah.
Joab, as basically chief of staff, if we just confine ourselves to his service to David, Joab's got to be concerned because David is distracted. His mind is on Absalom at times, and not always on the affairs of the kingdom. So on one hand, you've got Joab seemingly wanting the kingdom to run smoothly, and the king brooding about his wayward children and their various misdeeds. That's not good. But chapter 14 shows us a side of Joab that we really haven't seen too much of thus far. And that is his scheming side. The plan that he devises in verses 2 and 3 is really intended, at least in the short term, to show David that, Your Majesty, Your Highness, you need to send for Absalom and forgive him so that you can move on. So send to Tekoa, bring the actress, the cunning woman, and give her the script. Here's the script. You're a mourner. You had 2 sons. One murdered the other. You're being pressured to give up the one that committed the murder so that judgment can be passed against him. And it's going to leave you not just a widow, but childless. And here's exactly what you say. Joab spins out the script. How long did it take him to work this out? I don't know. Look over to verse 18. And after she has spun out all this long, involved story, the king answered, Do not hide from me anything I ask from you. All right, tell me the truth. Whatever you ask, I'll tell you. is the hand of Joab in all this? Did Joab put you up to this? Yes, sir, he did. Is it a reasonable supposition that Joab has probably been working on the king, twisting on him, nagging him about this for quite some time and getting nowhere? Probably so. Why is Joab so focused on bringing Absalom home? Well, distracted king doesn't rule well. Dissension within the king's family doesn't play well in the nation. As we go along, though, flip page, and where do we find Joab? Joab is going to want to be on the winning side of things. So the parable. Now, Tekoa, what's significant about Tekoa as far as this actress is concerned? That just happens to be where she's from. But biblically, what's the significance of Tekoa? That's the home of Amos, the prophet. Different time frame, but connection there. So here's the parable. Pick up at verse 4. Here's the story. Save me, O king. What's your trouble? I'm a widow. My husband's dead. I had 2 servants. They quarreled out in the field. No one was there to stop them, to separate them. One killed the other. The whole clan, the whole family has risen up. Now they want vengeance. They want to take the life of the other. And if they would destroy the heir, thus they would quench my coal that is left and leave to my husband neither name nor remnant on the face of the earth. So there at verse 7, here's the primary concern as she presents it is my husband's name, my husband's heritage in Israel is going to be wiped out if justice is done against my son who murdered my other son. Mm-hmm. In that ancient culture and in that family theocratic culture, there's no worse fate than to have your name die out, to be remembered no more. Your heritage, your inheritance, your belongingness in the nation is just gone. There's no heir left to you. Go back to the book of Judges, and at the end of the book of Judges, we have the issue about the daughters of Zelophehad and their inheritance. Women don't normally inherit property. Well, our father died. We're all sisters. What are we going to do about this? We don't want our father's name to die out in Israel. So there was provision in the law made for that. Well, this is something that would sound similar to that. My husband's name will die out in Israel. He'll be remembered no more. There's no greater catastrophe in that mindset than to just disappear, basically. So the king gives order. All right, I will grant your request that no one will touch the son. I'll give an order that the son will be safe so that this will not happen. Well, now there's one more thing, verse 11. Let the king invoke the Lord your God that the avenger of blood kill no more and my son be not destroyed. Okay, let's be more specific. Please give me a guarantee of his safety. Exempt him, basically. All right. As the Lord lives, not one hair of your son shall fall to the ground. Now, bear in mind, there's been no murder. There are no sons. This woman is playing a part. But we're not like the guy on TV. But wait, there's more. All right. Let me speak a word to my Lord the King. All right. Why have you done with your own family what you're now preventing in my family? Why have you planned such a thing against the people of God? In giving this decision, the king convicts himself, inasmuch as the king does not bring his banished one home again. All right. We must all die. We're like water spilled on the ground, which cannot be gathered up again, but God will not take away life, and he devises means so that the banished one will not remain an outcast. I have come to say this to my Lord and King, because the people have made me afraid, and your servant thought, I will speak to the king, etc., etc. And she's still playing the part. But at verse 14, she says, in effect, even the Lord lets evil people live unbanished in this life. What she's saying is, you might as well have killed Absalom, executed him, because he's banished. Now, there's no record that the king banished him. Go back to the end of chapter 13, and what do we read? Absalom ran away. In fact, Absalom fled, went to Talmai, the son of Ahimihud, the king of Geshur, and David mourned for his son day after day. Absalom fled, went to Geshur, was there 3 years. The spirit of the king longed to go out to Absalom because he was comforted about Amnon since he was dead. All right, basically, David is a realist. All right, Absalom murdered Amnon. I can't bring Amnon back. I'm not going to mourn for him forever. But Absalom, he's still alive. I'm mourning for him because he's not right with God. He's not right with me. He's not made this issue right. Now, the woman in her statement basically says, you might as well have killed him. You've banished him. Now, there's no statement that the king actually did banish him, but he is removed. He's not in Israel. He might as well be dead. That's the gist of what she's saying with the application of her little parable. So, at verses 15, 16, and 17, she says, you know, King, you're wise. You know how to deal with this. Your servant thought, the word of my Lord will set me at rest. All right. So you've told me what to do with my situation. What are you going to do with yours? Never mind that hers is imaginary. So at verses 18, 19, 20 that we talked about a minute ago, tell me truly, did Joab put you up to this? Oh, yes, sir, he did. All right. There's something about the application. You just see his antennas go up.
It's too thick. She laid it on too thick.
There you go. He heard this line of reasoning before, and he knows where he's heard it. Joab's been working on him somehow. Now, he does not commend Joab for his scheming. When he says down here when he asks, is the hand of Joab in all this? Then the woman says, as surely as you live, my lord the king, one cannot turn to the right or the left from anything that my lord the king has said. It was your servant Joab who commanded me. It was he who put all these words in the mouth of your servant in order to change the course of things. Your servant Joab did this. But my Lord has wisdom like the wisdom of the angel of God to know all things that are on the earth. So did Joab put you up to this? Oh, yes, but you should understand, you're smart enough to figure that. All right. David does see that there's some truth in what Joab had this woman say. In other words, yes, Absalom in being isolated and being functionally banished, even if it's his own action, he might as well be dead like the imaginary son of this woman. But more than that, Joab has revealed himself. Now, just pause and imagine for a moment how David is likely to feel toward Joab at this point. Joab has been his general. Joab has been his counselor. Clearly, Joab's been working on him about this. And now, how might David begin to feel about Joab?
The motives.
Joab, why are you so focused on this? He went to all the trouble to bring this woman from Tekoa, spin out this long, involved story, laid it on too thick, exposed himself in it. Do you suppose David's feeling maybe just a little bit manipulated here?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Big time.
There are not very many people that appreciate being manipulated. Now, go back to chapter 12, and what do we have in chapter 12? You've got Nathan, the prophet.
Oh yeah.
In a sense, doing the same thing. He's not manipulating David per se, the way Joab seems to be trying to.
Mhm.
But he uses the same kind of a stratagem. He spins out this parable and gets David, pays out the rope and lets David hang himself. But David's reaction is different with Nathan because it's David who is to be blamed. Here, and I want to say David is blameless because in one sense, he's not blameless. All of the heartache, the violence, the sin that has precipitated this in chapter 14, that traces back to David ultimately. But David is paying his penalty. And now to be arm twisted a little bit by Joab, and not for any clearly defined purpose at this point, you have to wonder if David is not looking a little bit, not too sure about where Joab's loyalties lie. After all, David had plenty of time in Saul's court before he became king to see just how people would maneuver in politics to try to work things to their own purposes. So pick up down here at verse 21, and from 21 to 23, we have David and Joab discussing this, and Joab manages to secure permission for Absalom to come home. The king speaks to Joab. I grant this. All right, you've made your point, Joab. Go bring back the young man Absalom. All right, let him come home. He'll no longer be functionally dead in Israel. But there's a caveat. At verse 24, let him dwell apart in his own house. He's not to come into my presence. He can come home. He can come back to Jerusalem. Now, Joab's response, oh, today your servant knows that I have found favor in your sight, my Lord. He's just laying it on thick. You know, huzzah and hooray. You finally seen the light. Fine, go fetch him home. But don't you bring him to the palace. Let him stay in his own house. So, David is, at the end of chapter 13, his heart longs to go out to Absalom. He wants this resolved. But there's some subtext here that's not clearly stated. He apparently knows Absalom's temper Absalom's spirit. Why would Absalom wait 2 years after Amnon raped Tamar to take vengeance on him? Why did he not go right then?
It's another strategy.
Could it be that he was waiting to see what David would do? He was angry, but he waited to see. After 2 full years, Absalom creates this situation. David did nothing about it. So now Absalom gets to come home, but David is very, very firm. He can come home, but I don't want to see him. He's not forgiven the murder that he committed. He's on probation, basically. So pick up now at 25, and from 25 down really to the end of the chapter, the focus shifts from David to Absalom. Absalom is his father's child. He is a handsome man. David was handsome, good-looking young man when he was young. Absalom is a good-looking man, from the sole of his foot to the crown of his head, no blemish. He cut his hair at the end of every year, and there was a lot of it. 3 sons, 1 daughter. The daughter's name is Tamar, named for his sister, apparently. And that would seem to indicate that he maintains his loyalty to his sister. The implication seems to be that these children are born while he is there in Jerusalem. How long could he go with this child, this daughter named Tamar, before his father hears that he has named his daughter for his sister? There is an implication, sort of a poke in the eyes to the father with that. So he lives 2 years in Jerusalem, does not ever see David's face. Let's think about this. Okay. Amnon devises his scheme with help and rapes Tamar. Having raped her, he's done with her, wants nothing to do with her, throws her out. He has ruined her life. Absalom waits 2 whole years basically to see if David's going to do anything, and David does nothing about it. So Absalom engineers the murder of Amnon and then has to flee. He's gone for 3 years, so now we've got 5 years. He's waited 2 years for David to do something, then takes the law into his own hands. Now he's isolated for 3 more years. 5 years have passed since the rape of Tamar. David allows him to come home. He comes home. He dwells in Jerusalem in his own house, has children. And for 2 more years, David will have nothing to do with him. So we've got 7 years that Absalom has been brooding over the wrong done to his sister. And after the 2 years in Jerusalem, Absalom sends for Joab. Notice how this is expressed at verse 28. Absalom lived 2 full years in Jerusalem without coming into the king's presence. Then Absalom sent for Joab to send him to the king. But Joab would not come to him. He sent a second time, but Joab would not come. Good evening, sir. Come on in. There is something to the wording here that we don't want to overlook. Who is Joab? in David's administration. Joab is David's
The mighty man.
general. He's not the major domo. He's more like the chief of staff. He is the number one counselor to a large degree. Absalom, even though Joab has engineered his return to Jerusalem, for 2 years, Absalom's basically been a nobody as far as the court is concerned. And now Absalom has sent for Joab as if he is the prince of the kingdom in good standing. I call and you come. Joab engineered his return. There's nothing here that indicates that Absalom had been communicating with Joab to arrange this. But Absalom is acting with Joab, or seems to be acting with Joab, as if he's the one in charge and Joab is his servant. So, sends for Joab, Joab doesn't come. He sends again, Joab doesn't come. You think about this from a political point of view. This is a little bit like this would be a little bit like Nancy Pelosi sending for Chuck Schumer. And Schumer saying, who does she think she is? I'm the Speaker of the Senate. She's just the House Majority Leader, Speaker of the House. Who does she think she is to order me around? So Absalom says, all right, look, I got a field next door to Joab's field. Go burn down Joab's field. See if that doesn't get his attention. So they burned Joab's barley field. Well, yeah, that got his attention. Joab goes to Absalom's house. What do you think you're doing, burning down my field? Look at Absalom's response here in chapter 14. At verse 32, I sent word to you, come here that I may send you to the king. Absalom's acting like he's the one in charge here, isn't he? Now, this is condensed in this form. I sent for you to send you to the king to ask, why have I come from Geshur? It would be better for me to still be there. In other words, I sent for you to come and see if you can't get this restriction on me lifted. But there seems to be an attitude here that Absalom thinks he's the one giving the orders, and Joab, being the one in the court, being a high-ranking official, you may be the king's son, but you're also the king's son, the murderer. And who do you think you are ordering me around? And Absalom is trying to be pretty forceful with him. And so Joab does go to the king. Notice the summary of this, though, in at the end of verse 32. Now, therefore, let me go into the presence of the king. And if there is guilt in me, let him put me to death. In other words, Absalom is pushing. If there is guilt in me. If there is guilt, he was guilty of murder. But if David doesn't execute him for that murder, it's tantamount to declaring him innocent. And so Joab goes to the king on his behalf. The king summons Absalom, and Absalom bows down and acts all humble, and the king embraces him. So there is a reconciliation, or so there seems to be. In chapter 15, the first thing that we see is that the reconciliation on Absalom's part was a fiction. Whether he had this spirit of rebellion all along, or whether 7 years of David having done nothing about his sister and then allowing him to languish separated, and then being humiliated by coming back but not being allowed back into the king's good graces, whether that had turned his heart, soured him on his father, or if he'd been that scheming way all along, we have no way of knowing. But at this point, Absalom has a plan. And David may hope that Absalom has reformed, is genuinely repentant, whatever. The inspired writer makes it clear he was nothing of the sort. So after the reconciliation, Absalom sets himself up. And what he's doing is he's laying the groundwork for a rebellion, for an insurrection. And chapters 15, 16, 17, 18, that's exactly what we're going to see, is the rebellion of Absalom. Pick up at the beginning of verse 1 in chapter 15. After this, that is, Absalom's actions from this point forward are going to provide a cautionary tale, a warning, if you will, about the danger of, in his case, the danger of boundless, untempered, uncontrolled confidence in yourself. Now, you look at David's actions, and in chapters 15 through 19, you have Absalom, who is absolutely confident in himself, and you have David, who is very humble and humbled and very cautious about the steps that he takes. So Absalom gets himself a chariot and horses and 50 men to run before him. Well, what's the significance of that? You go back to Moses' day. You go back to Joshua's day. You go back to the beginning of the kingdom when the people come to Samuel and say, "You're old and your sons aren't like you. Make us a king to rule over us and do this and do this and do this and do this." And what does Samuel tell them? You want a king? Here's what he's going to do to you. He's going to take your daughters to be his servants. He's going to take your sons to be his soldiers. He's going to make himself chariots and horsemen and skim your crops and whatnot. He's going to use you for himself. Well, that's what Saul did. We don't see David associated particularly with chariots, but here's Absalom acting like the heir apparent, acting like the crown prince would in any other country around them. It's an act of ego on one level. Absalom's head's just getting bigger and bigger. But it's also, in a sense, it's a poke in the eye to David, who is not acting this way, not putting on this kind of show. It in one sense, as much as anything, it says, I'll show you what a real king ought to look and act like, even though he's not the king. And David sits back and lets him, basically. But he doesn't stop just with the show. Used to rise early, stand beside the way of the gate. He didn't go into the place where judgment was rendered. He stayed outside. But when any man had a dispute to come before the king for judgment, Absalom would call to him and say, "From what city are you? Your servant is of such and such a tribe." Absalom would say to him, see, your claims are good and right, but there's no man designated by the king to hear you. Oh, that I were judge in the land. Then every man with a dispute or a cause might come to me, and I would give him justice. Well, wait a minute. What if two parties to the dispute both come to him? Not going to give justice that way. What's Absalom doing? Come down to verse 6. Thus did Absalom to all of Israel who came to the king for judgment. So Absalom stole the hearts of the men of Israel. Now, he set himself up to appear very kingly, very, very big show. Think of our former mayor here in the Atlanta area, running all over Atlanta in a convoy of SUVs with flashing blue lights everywhere he went. He put on a show everywhere he went. That's what Absalom is doing here. Well, he then says, it's a shame the king can't set somebody to decide all of these things. Wait a minute. Who is he telling this to? People who are coming to the king for a decision. And Absalom's words are undermining the king as judge of these matters. It's a shame there's nobody to hear these claims. Wait a minute. Who's he saying this to? People who have come to the king for the king to hear these matters. And they haven't been rejected by the king. They haven't yet gotten to him. But Absalom has prejudged the case invariably in favor of whoever he's talking to. I would do him justice. I would give him justice. What's the implication of that?
He campaigned and trying to get him on his side.
Well, he's clearly trying to get them on his side, but the way that's said, I would do him justice, that implies you're not going to get justice from the king.
Mm-hmm.
Anybody that acknowledges Absalom now is in his pocket. He stole the hearts of the people. That was his intention. And he was actually pretty open about it. We have to wonder, why does David not take action? Surely this is not hidden from him. It's done out in the open. But David kind of has a blind spot, doesn't he? Amnon raped Tamar, and Absalom bided his time for 2 years. At the end of 2 full years, David has done nothing about it. So Absalom engineers the murder of Amnon and then runs away to Geshur for 3 years. And after 3 years, Joab maneuvers to get him back to Jerusalem, but the king won't see him. He'll let him come home, but he won't see him for 2 more years. And then finally, Absalom maneuvers to get a reconciliation with the king. 7 years pass from the incident that instigated all of this. But notice down here in chapter 15 at verse 7, 4 more years pass. 4 years that Absalom is stealing the hearts of the people. 4 years that David does nothing about Absalom parading around like he's the heir apparent to the throne. Why would David let that slide? Now, if you look at verse 7 in the King James, the American Standard, the Douay-Rheims, all of the older translations, it says after 40 years, 40. And that's a textual problem. The Textus Receptus, the Latin text on which the King James was originally based, says 40 years, which is a scribal error. You go back to the Septuagint, Syriac translations, the much older translations of the ancient Hebrew, it's not 40 years, it's 4 years. So you've got the textual problem here that is solved by comparing the ancient translations. And it is a scribal error in the Textus Receptus, in the Latin translation that was largely the basis of the King James Version. So it's 4, not 40 years. Josephus, the ancient Jewish historian, accounts it as 4 years. So here's the plan now at the end of this 4 years. Absalom has spent 4 years campaigning, basically, to become king. At the end of 4 years, please let me go pay my vow that I've vowed to the Lord in Hebron. I vowed a vow while I lived at Geshur in Aram. If the Lord would bring me back to Jerusalem, then I will offer worship to the Lord. Go in peace. He arose and went to Hebron. There was no vow. This is a lie from start to finish. And it says a lot about Absalom that he's willing to lie to his father's face. But when we see what he's up to, it's understandable why. It makes perfect sense. So Absalom goes and sends messengers to everybody. When you hear the announcement that Absalom is king, you rally to me at Hebron. You come to me at Hebron. Now, what's special about Hebron?
Is it like the center, like the centralized?
It's actually not. It's in the south of the territory. But it's in the territory of Judah. And that's where David was first crowned. And David ruled over Judah for 7.5 years from Hebron.
Right.
So going there and staking his claim, Absalom is making it plain that he intends to take David's place. Mm-hmm. So he's got 200 men with him from Jerusalem. They didn't know anything. They were innocent. They were not part of they were not party to his scheme, to his plans. These are men who are to go to the supposed sacrificial ceremony. Absalom is offering sacrifices at verse 12. Well, he's going through the motions. And in the meantime, he sends for Ahithophel, who is one of David's counselors. And the conspiracy grew strong, and the people with Absalom kept increasing. Now, how old is David at this point? David has got to be at least in his late 50s, probably in his early 60s. He's not actually, he's going to die at 70. And he's not going to be a long way off from the end of his reign. He's been king for probably 30 years or more at this point. At least somewhere close to that. The fact that people are gathering to Absalom may indicate that David's popularity, David's energy, David's direct involvement may have begun to kind of taper off at this point. Remember, after the murder of Amnon, we see things kind of tip over David's kingdom has been on the rise, and when Amnon is murdered by Absalom, things kind of tip over. And we don't read so much about the exploits of David. We don't read so much about the great things that he accomplished. Now we see him basically trying to keep things together. Yeah. After the sin with Bathsheba, after the sin of Absalom, now it's a matter of trying to maintain things. And the fact that people are gathering to Absalom may be an indicator that David has perhaps neglected some of his responsibilities, or has not been as forward in dealing with them as he could have been. So you get down here, and at verse 13, a messenger came to David. The hearts of the men of Israel have gone after Absalom. David said to all his servants at Jerusalem, "Arise, let us flee, or there will be no escape for us from Absalom. Go quickly, lest he overtake us quickly and bring down ruin on us and strike the city with the edge of the sword." So David's perspective on this is, okay, I see what's happened, but I don't want war right here in Jerusalem. I don't want a bunch of innocent people killed right here in Jerusalem. So he evacuates the city. He packs up and takes his household. And verse 17, the king went out, all the people after him, and they halted at the last house. All his servants passed by him, the Cherethites and the Pelethites. All the 600 Gittites who followed him from Gath passed on before the king. That is, these are folks that were his personal bodyguard, his personal servants, the 600 faithful men who had been with him when he was being pursued by Saul. These are the guys that go back to the very beginning with him. Now you pick up at verse 19, and here is one of these guys, Ittai of Gath. And David says, you go on, pass on. And Ittai the Gittite passed on with all his men and all the little ones who were with him. And all the land wept aloud as the people passed by. The king crossed the brook Kidron, and all the people passed on toward the wilderness. So he evacuates the city. Ittai is a Philistine from the city of Gath. He seems to be the general of this group, and he brings a lot of followers and their families with him. And he is loyal to exactly one person in the whole world, and that's David. No matter what, he is David's man. As we go along through here, chapter 15, they go out into the wilderness, that is, away from the city. And at verse 24, here's Abiathar. Now, who's Abiathar? Zadok brings Zadok with the Levites, and they're bringing the Ark of the Covenant. And they set it down until the people passed out of the city. And notice what David says, take the Ark back. The priests have been leading the way. Now they wait for everybody that's following to catch up, pass them by. And David looks at what's happening. What is happening to David? He's on the run. Flashbacks to the days of Saul. Headed out into the wilderness again. Same people with him, just 25, 30 years later. Same kind of experience, somebody hunting for him. And David's perspective, verses 25 and 26, this is God's punishment. This is God's judgment on me. Take the ark back, put it back where it belongs. If I find favor in the eyes of the Lord, he'll bring me back. And if he says, I have no pleasure in you, then fine, let him do what he wants, but basically the ark doesn't need to be with me when that happens, or if that happens. The king then challenges Zadok. Are you not a seer? Yes, the implication is he is a prophet of God. Go back to the city in peace. Take your son Ahaz and Jonathan, the son of Abiathar, and I'll wait at the fords of the wilderness until word comes from you to inform me. So they go back, they put go back and put the Ark of the Covenant back where it belongs. David is not going to, there is battle coming. That much is obvious, even if it's just David and his 600 men surrounded by Absalom and his troops. There's battle coming. The last time the Ark of the Covenant was taken into battle, the Philistines took possession of it, and it was a bad business all around. David is not going to have any part of that. Put the ark back where it belongs. This object that in our minds represents God's presence among his people, I'm not going to have the responsibility of taking the Lord's presence, so to speak. He's the judge, not me. So they go back, they stay in Jerusalem, and David goes on. Now, this all takes place right outside the city. David has crossed the Kidron, which is the little brook that runs down the east side of the city. Across from the city is the Mount of Olives. This is the area that from Solomon's day forward will be directly across the valley from the temple, but the temple isn't built yet. So there's no temple to put the Ark of the Covenant into. There's just the ark that's been brought to the city. Put the ark back. We're across the brook. He goes up the Mount of Olives. This is the place that Jesus would go in the evening with the disciples. This is the place that he would go to rest, to get away from the throngs and the people and so forth. Here's David going up the Mount of Olives, weeping as he went, barefoot with his head covered. In other words, basically signs of mourning all over him. All the people with their heads covered, weeping as they went. And it was told to David, Ahithophel is among the conspirators with Absalom. And notice David's prayer, "O Lord, please turn the counsel of Ahithophel into foolishness." Turn the counsel of Ahithophel into foolishness. David has ensured that the Ark of the Covenant goes back to the city by refusing to move until he knows that it's there. As far as he's concerned, what's happening to him, this is God's punishment for the wrongs I've done. And now he learns that Ahithophel is a traitor. Turn the counsel of Ahithophel into foolishness. Well, it will be perceived that way. But in the meantime, now David is coming up to the summit of the Mount of Olives. He's getting up to the level where he can see back into the city, the area where God was worshiped. And Hushai the Archite came to meet him. And his coat's torn, he's got dirt on his head, he's got signs of either of mourning or of battle. And David says, if you go on with me, you'll be a burden to me. That indicates that Hushai is old, that Hushai can't move rapidly anymore. So here's a little plan. David's not above a little bit of planning of his own. Go back to the city. Offer yourself to Absalom. Absalom would know Hushai is what? One of David's former trusted associates. You go offer yourself to Absalom. Say, I will be your servant as I have been your father's servant. I'll serve you. And then you'll be placed to defeat the counsel of Ahithophel. Hushai becomes an informant for David, a spy in Absalom's court. And that's the balance of chapter 15. You've got Absalom there, you've got Zadok, his sons there who are loyal to David. And so Hushai, David's friend, came to the city just as Absalom was entering Jerusalem. He gets back just as Absalom arrives and presents himself. He's accepted. And Ahithophel comes to Jerusalem with Absalom. Now, at chapter 16, from verse 1 down to about verse 14, the scenery remains with David. The story remains with David. And here is where David gets some comeuppance for some of his past sins. He endures some humiliation. Now, Ziba, the servant of Mephibosheth. Remember, Ziba is the guy that David put in charge of Mephibosheth's estate. Mephibosheth is Jonathan's son, whom David had wanted to bless and spare and be good to for the sake of his love for Jonathan. Here comes Ziba, pair of donkeys, 200 loaves of bread, 100 bunches of grapes or raisins, summer fruit, wine. Why have you brought these? Well, the donkeys are for the king's household to ride on, the bread and the fruit for the young men to eat, and the wine for those who are fainting in the wilderness. Look down at verse 3, though. Where is your master's son? Where is Mephibosheth? Oh, he remains in Jerusalem. He said, today the house of Israel will give me back the kingdom of my father. Oh. Ziba is doing a little scheming of his own. Now, at verse 4, the king said to Ziba, behold, all that belonged to Mephibosheth is now yours. And Ziba said, I'll pay homage. Let me ever find favor in your sight, my lord the king. So there is a worm in the apple, and Ziba is the worm. Ziba brings all of this help to David, stuff that was legitimately needed, food and so forth. But along with it, he brings a lie that Mephibosheth is conspiring against David, that Mephibosheth hopes to have the house of Saul restored to the king. And David's response, all right, everything that belongs to Mephibosheth is now yours. It's going to turn out that this was a lie. Ziba was a Trojan horse of sorts. He came bearing gifts to try to buy his way into control of Mephibosheth's estate, which he did obtain. But now they move on. Verses 5 to 14, and then we'll take a break. Verses 5 to 14, we encounter a fellow named Shimei. And Shimei is a distant relative of King Saul. They came to Bahurim as they're moving along. There came out a man of the family of the house of Saul, Shimei, the son of Gera. And as he came, he cursed continually, threw stones at David and all the servants of King David, and all the people and the mighty men were on his right hand and on his left, and said as he cursed, get out, you man of blood, you worthless man. The Lord has avenged on you all the blood of the house of Saul, in whose place you reigned. And the Lord has given the kingdom into the hand of your son Absalom. See, your evil is on you, for you're a man of blood. Now, a bloodthirsty man is the meaning of that idea of man of blood. You're bloodthirsty. You're troubled because of it. And Shimei has some truth mixed in with what he's saying. There is some truth here. That is, the Lord has avenged on you, but it's not the house of Saul. And the blood of the house of Saul is not on David. David was not responsible for that. But Shimei accuses him of being bloodthirsty and being responsible for the fall of Saul and so forth. And Abishai wants to just let me go put this sorry dog out of your misery. Let me go silence him. I'll take his head off. David's response is, I don't want to have anything to do with your feeling of outrage toward him. What do I have to do with you? Well, sons of Zeruiah, these are David's friends and supporters. But what he's saying, what have I to do with you? I don't want any part of what you're feeling. I don't want that resentment to be on me. So they let him curse. They let Shimei go on, verses 11 through 14. And you know, he's cursing because the Lord David says he's doing what the Lord told him to do. You know, as far as I'm concerned, who am I to say you shouldn't do this? David is at a low point in his life right now. He is very, very much feeling the weight of God's judgment against him. Remember, in the aftermath of Bathsheba and Uriah, what had Nathan told him?
He will never depart.
You are never going to have peace among your children because of this sin. And boy, that's coming back to him in spades right now. He is feeling the weight of that. That is topmost in his mind right now. So when Shimei, who is part of Saul's extended family, is cursing at him, you know, Abishai says, let me go put him out of your misery. I'll take his head off of him. No. And David is, I don't want to say beaten down at this point, but David is at the point where he's saying, there's too much truth. There's too much responsibility on my part in what he's saying. For all I know, it may be the Lord inspiring him to curse me.
Just heartbroken.
You know, he's just, David he's on his way to the wilderness. You know, he's been run out of his own kingdom by his own son. So David and his men went on the road while Shimei went along on the hillside across from them, cursed and threw stones at him and flung dust. And the king and all the people who were with him arrived weary at the Jordan. And there he refreshed himself. So they've traveled a good little ways down to the River Jordan. And now the scene is going to shift back from David to Absalom. It's 7:45. Let's take a break and then we'll reconvene at 8 or a minute or so after. Questions or thoughts before we do?
Great lesson.
Okay. Well, let me pause this. We're in chapter 16, 2 Samuel. And picking up at verse 15 now, Absalom, the scene shifts from David now back to Absalom, and this is Absalom's arrival at Jerusalem. And here, the rest of chapter 16, we find Hushai, David's faithful servant, ingratiating himself with Absalom. He is becoming David's spy in Absalom's camp, or David's Trojan horse of sorts in Absalom's camp. And that's a good thing for David, not so good for Absalom. Notice, though, the interplay between these two, picking up at verse 16. Hushai the Archite, David's friend, came to Absalom. Hushai said to Absalom, long live the king, long live the king. And Absalom said to Hushai, is this your loyalty to your friend? In other words, is this how you repay David's friendship? Why did you not go with him? Now, notice how Hushai replies here. In verse 18, whom the Lord and this people and all the men of Israel have chosen, his I will be, and with him I will remain. And again, whom should I serve? Should it not be his son? As I have served your father, so I will serve you. So Hushai is a little bit cagey in his choice of words. He doesn't diss David. He doesn't dismiss David, but he lets Absalom hear what he wants to hear. That he lets Absalom hear, I've accepted you as king. As I have served your father, I will serve you. But in all of this, there's that caveat, whom the Lord chooses. Now, Hushai knows who the Lord has chosen, and it's not Absalom. But he's telling Absalom what he wants to hear. So now, Absalom turns to Ahithophel for advice. Now, Ahithophel had been David's counselor. Ahithophel had been trusted by David. And this is one of the reasons David is, as he flees, one of the reasons he is so disheartened is that his trusted counselor Ahithophel has thrown in with his rebel son. But Absalom says, all right, what should I do, Ahithophel? How should I consolidate this? He's come from Hebron to Jerusalem. He's made the journey in a matter of days that David took 7.5 years to make. And so what should I do? Well, Ahithophel says, all right, you need to claim your father's throne. And the way you do that is you let the people of Israel see you claim his harem, claim his concubines. He's left some of a concubine in that day is not a full-fledged wife. A concubine is sort of a junior wife or a secondary wife. She is the property of her husband. She is his wife. He has rights with her, and her children, her sons, have some inheritance rights. But she does not have the rights of a full-fledged wife. And so when David leaves, he leaves some of the concubines behind, basically to tend the house, to take care of the palace. So Ahithophel says, you go in, we'll pitch a tent up here on the roof, and you take them as yours. Now remember, when David became king, he had several wives, but who else did he inherit from Saul? He inherited Saul's
wives.
And that was one of the indicators that he has become the king, is that he has taken Saul's concubines. Now, whether he did anything with them or not is beside the point. Here, Absalom goes in and effectively defiles David's concubines because David's still alive. This is an act that says, I have conquered, I have taken control, I'm the new king, I'm in charge. And notice the terminology, this says you have made yourself a stench to David, a stink. In other words, this is an act of open rebellion, a declaration of independence against him, against David. So you do this and there's no going back. And that says to the people, I have staked my claim. So that's what he does. But in chapter 17, we're going to have a little different scenario. By the way, notice the last verse of chapter 16. In those days, the counsel of Ahithophel was as if one consulted the word of God. So was all the counsel of Ahithophel esteemed, both by David and by Absalom. Up to this point, Ahithophel has been David's trusted counselor. He considered Ahithophel's advice basically on a par with God's instructions. And Absalom is going to treat him the same way, or at least initially. But now in chapter 17, here is a proposition. Ahithophel says, let me choose out 12,000 chosen men, 12,000 picked men. And we'll just go hunt David down and put paid to him, and that'll be the end of it. We'll just consolidate our gains right here and be done with it. I'll bring all the people back to you like a bride comes home to her husband. You know, we'll throttle any division right here in the cradle, so to speak. And that seemed like a real good idea to Absalom, because as long as David is alive, there is a rival king in Israel. Absalom's rulership is not absolute as long as David is alive. So obviously he wants to get rid of David. Ahithophel says, here's how we can do it. While David is on the run, while he's weak, while he doesn't have an army, before he has a chance to raise an army, let me take an elite force and just go wipe them out. Sounds good. And the elders of Israel that are on Absalom's side, that sounds good to them too. But now here's Hushai. Call for Hushai. What do you think, Hushai? And Hushai says, this is not such a good idea. This is not a good idea, and here's why. David is nothing if not a skillful, experienced warrior. And the men that are with him, they are all battle-tested, proven, skillful men. You know, he may just have 600 men with him, but they're a match for 12,000 men. Their experience and their cunning and their skill, you're not going to take them easily, not even with 12,000. And you can bet, Hushai says, that they're not just all traveling together with all the women and the baggage and the little ones and so forth. They'll keep them isolated to keep them out of harm's way. And the men, David and the soldiers, they'll be holed up in a cave or in a ravine somewhere separate. And when word comes to them that you have fallen on their wives and their children, they're going to be like an enraged bear. And they're going to fight twice as hard. This is not a good idea. So look down here at verse 10. He says, then even the valiant man, whose heart is like the heart of a lion, will utterly melt with fear, for all Israel knows your father is a mighty man, and those who were with him are valiant men. Here's my counsel, verse 11. You know, if you attack now, David's going to win, because he's going to be like a wounded animal. He's going to fight like a maniac. Here's my counsel. Let all Israel be gathered to you from Dan to Beersheba. Take the time to consolidate your hold on the nation, so that when you do go to battle, the numbers of your army are like the sands of the sea. Then, when we find David, we'll so outnumber him, we'll just saturate him. We'll be like the dew that falls on the ground, and nobody will be left. We'll be so overwhelming that they can't win. And if he holds up in a city, then we'll pull down the city till not one pebble is left on top of another, till not even a pebble is found there. And you get down here to verse 14. Oh, that's a better idea than Ahithophel. Well, the Lord ordained to defeat Ahithophel's counsel, so that the Lord might bring harm upon Absalom. In all of this, God is present. And one of the outstanding distinctions between David and Absalom here is that Absalom acts on his own desire. Absalom acts on his own lust. Absalom acts on the counsel of his counselors. Absalom never takes into account God. David will act on good counsel. David will act on the basis of his own experience. But the very first thing that David does in dealing with all of this is what? He consults God. So that separates the two of them in this respect. So now Hushai is in a position of influence. His plan has been accepted, and word goes out then for David to forewarn him of what's going on. Now, he uses Zadok and Abiathar, the priests, to send word to David. They're in cahoots together, Hushai and Abiathar, Zadok, and so forth. This was Ahithophel's counsel. This was my counsel. Go tell David, do not stay at the fords of the wilderness. Pass over. Keep going. Don't stop. Keep going. Keep going. Keep moving till you're safe. Jonathan and Ahimaaz are in Rogel, and they send the word. They're to go tell King David they're not to be seen entering the city, but what happens? They're spied out. The feelings of the high priest of Zadok, these are known to Absalom. Absalom has heard that when David was leaving town, what did the priest do? He packed up the Ark of the Covenant and was leaving with David. And so Absalom knows that the priests are not with him. He's not concerned about that. He's not concerned about their support particularly. And his sons are seen, but hidden away and then sent on their way. A young man saw them, told Absalom, verse 18, both of them went quickly, came to the house of a man at Bahurim who had a well in his courtyard. They went down in it. The woman spread a covering over the well's mouth, scattered grain on it. Nothing was known of it. So they're hiding in a hidey hole. And the well is hidden. Where are Ahimaaz and Jonathan? And the woman said, they've gone over the brook of water. They've crossed over. They sought and could not find them. They returned to Jerusalem. So these guys are being hunted, but they escape. And now they come to David and deliver the message. You better scat. You better scram while you can. And David uses the advice that was given to him. So he picks up and goes. By daybreak, no one was left who had not crossed the Jordan. Ahithophel thought in his planning, we'll catch David before he gets across the Jordan. Hushai managed to forestall that until David could get across the Jordan. And once he's across, the land is open before him. He can go any direction. And they'd be hard pressed to catch him at that point. Now, come down and notice at verse 23 here in chapter 17. When Ahithophel saw that his counsel was not followed, he saddled his donkey, went off home to his own city, set his house in order, and hanged himself. And he died and was buried in the tomb of his father. So why would Ahithophel, just because Absalom didn't take his advice on this one thing, why would Ahithophel go commit suicide? Well, think about it.
He's a nothing at this point.
Is it because he feared David would kill him anyway?
He is as good as dead if anything good happens for David. If David gets away, he's missed his chance. Absalom has missed his chance. He had given the counsel, go catch him while you can, while he's weak. If David gets away, then he's vindicated, but his counsel hasn't been followed. If anything good happens to David, that is, if Absalom doesn't consolidate and control, he's as good as dead if David comes back to the throne, because he's a traitor. And his influence with Absalom has been compromised by Hushai. So basically, he sees himself in a box. He sees himself in a can't-win situation. If David escapes, what's he going to say to Absalom? I told you so. Well, Absalom is nominally the king. That doesn't go well with an angry king, does it? So he has nothing to gain, basically. In the meantime, David uses the advice that was given to him. He came to Mahanaim. Absalom crossed the Jordan with all the men of Israel. Absalom's chasing him, and he sets Amasa over the army in place of Joab. Amasa, now notice this in verse 25. Amasa was the son of a man named Ithra the Ishmaelite, who had married Abigail, the daughter of Nahash, the sister of Zeruiah, Joab's mother. And Israel and Absalom encamped in the land of Gilead. So they're in actually the territory of King Saul's family at this point. But Amasa is a man of apparently some mixed parentage, some mixed background. And in the meantime, David is at Mahanaim, and the Shobi, the son of Nahash from Rabbah, and Machir from Lodebar, and Barzillai the Gileadite from Rohelim, they brought supplies, beds and basins and food and honey and so forth. These people who had been David's early supporters, who had been David's local supporters, some of them perhaps even Gentiles, or maybe Jews called by names of the Gentile cities where they lived, they're supplying David and his people. These are folks out on the fringes of Israel, long way away from the politics and the machinery and the scheming and so forth. Think of these as the salt of the earth, ordinary folks in Israel. David is their king. They're on his side. And these are not the people that Absalom had been able to buy away with his promises. So they're loyal and faithful to David. Amasa takes Joab's place. Joab had been the chief of staff, and Absalom has used him, but then discarded him and put Amasa in his place. Amasa is a cousin of Joab, but this is a gesture on Absalom's part that basically is a gesture of disrespect to Joab, even though he had used Joab for his own purposes, and Joab had been his advocate in David's court. So we come into chapter 18 now, and in chapter 18, we're going to see preparations for war between David's followers and Absalom's followers. We'll see them in battle, and we'll see the fall of Absalom. But in this, we also see in this civil war that Absalom's lust for power, which is in a roundabout way the product of David's sin, Absalom's lust for power precipitates a civil war that produces 20,000 Israelite casualties. A lot of Israelites are going to die in battle because of this, including Absalom. So you pick up in chapter 18, the first 5 verses. Here are the preparations for war. And you've got 3 trusted generals mentioned here. 2 of them are Jewish and 1 of them is a Gentile. David mustered the men who were with him, set over them commanders of thousands and commanders of hundreds, sent out the army, 1/3 under the command of Joab, he's a Jewish general, 1/3 under the command of Abishai, the son of Zeruiah, Joab's brother, and 1/3 under the command of Ittai the Gittite, Ittai of Gath. He's a Philistine. And the king said to the men, I myself will also go out with you. And they said, you shall not go out, for if we flee, they will not care about us. If half of us die, they will not care about us. But you are worth 10,000 of us. Therefore, it's better that you send us help from the city. So in other words, what they say to David basically is, look, if you're out in the battle, you're the only thing that they care about, and everybody's going to come after you. So here's what we want you to do. We want you to basically be in command of the ready reserve. Whatever reserve we have at the back of the battle line, you're going to be in command of that, and you send help to whichever one of us needs it as the battle rages. That's the gist of what they're proposing to him. And
So is this Gittite, Ittai the Gittite, is that, did he become a proselyte?
Presumably so. Nothing is said about his faith except that he is David's servant, and it's kind of hard to imagine that he is accepted in Israel if he is still worshiping idols, if he's still worshiping Dagon. He has been with David all along, so it's a pretty reasonable assumption that he has been accepted as a proselyte Jew. But the Jews being the people that they were, he's known by his origins, and he is a Philistine of Gath. So they say, you stay back, stay out of the thick of battle. And David says in verse 4, whatever seems best, I'll do. And so he stood at the side of the gate while the army marched out by hundreds and by thousands. And the king ordered Joab and Abishai and Ittai, deal gently. Notice how he says this. The king ordered this, deal gently for my sake with the young man Absalom. And the people heard when the king gave the orders to all the commanders about Absalom. So he says this publicly. You know, this is not just for them, it's for all the soldiers that hear as well. You deal gently with Absalom. You know, if you come upon Absalom, you're not to kill him. That's the gist of what he's telling them. You don't get to kill him. I want him spared. Well, why? He may be a rebel. He may be a skunk and a scoundrel. He's still my child. He's still my child. And you know, even as much bad blood as there's been between them, David still wants him, you know, it would be salt in the wound of God's judgment on David's house for them to kill Absalom, especially in battle, in rebellion against David. So deal gently with him. Pick up at verse 6. The army goes out into the field. They go out to the battle against Israel, fought in the forest of Ephraim, which gives us a general area right in the heart, in the breadbasket of Israel, so to speak. The men of Israel were defeated there by the servants of David. The loss was great, 20,000 men. The battle spread over the face of all the country, and the forest devoured more people that day than the sword. And how that happened is not explicitly stated. How did the forest devour more than the sword? It would be rough country. It may well be that falls and injuries contributed as much as anything. But God is, you're right, Mr. Paul, God is on David's side. And it's not his will for David to be defeated. The ravines, the bluffs and the cliffs, marshes in that area claimed more lives than the people with swords did. You know, whether you're chased off a cliff or you slip and fall, the result is basically the same. But pick up at verse 9.
Go to verse 8.
Yeah.
What does it says? In mine it says, "For the battle was there scattered over the face of all the country,
Right.
and the wood devoured more people than the sword."
Yeah.
What?
The woods, the forest,
The woods killed more people.
the area is what it's talking about.
The territory.
Right. The area where the battle is being fought is a rough country. It's hilly. It has ravines and cliffs and marshes, and it's in World War I and in World War II, actually, in the Battle of the Bulge.
Right.
But the Battle of the Ardennes Forest in World War I in France was a huge battle between the Germans on one side and the English, French, Americans on the other side. And the worst part of the battle was that the terrain was so rugged that they about half killed themselves just getting to each other to kill each other. In the Battle of the Bulge in World War II, you had much the same scenario, much the same situation. It was thought that this forest was so thick that they couldn't pass through it. And that's exactly where they went to get through it. Well, here, they're fighting in an area that was so rough, so thick with trees in spots, so rugged territory in other spots, had marshy swamplands in places. It's not like the plain of Megiddo, which was the traditional area where armies would fight. It's not clear open country where you can see everybody and you can see your enemy and run straight at him.
Would a good example be then right here in Kennesaw when they tried to march down through Florida because it was hilly?
Well, yeah, think about all this
shooting down different terrain, different.
Think about all this Piedmont area country where it's up and down and rugged, and go up to Chattanooga to Lookout Mountain, and you know, here's General Grant on Lookout Mountain trying to survey the battle, but the territory is so rough and the clouds are in the way and so forth. You can't even see what's going on part of the time. Well, that's what's going on here, is that these guys are fighting the territory. These guys are fighting what God made as much as they're fighting each other. So things do not go well for Absalom's forces. David's men have been fighting this kind of in this kind of territory all their lives. This is old hat to them in a way. And so as things are not going well, Absalom meets the servants of David. He's riding on a mule. Now, there's an interesting comparison here. The traditional mount, the traditional riding animal for the kings of Israel is a donkey. And you know, a donkey is about this high, and a donkey is not a war animal. A mule is not a donkey. A mule is a cross between a donkey and a horse. And in one sense, it looks like a kingly mount in Israel because it looks sort of like a donkey. but it's got the size and the speed of a horse. In this, you have an image of Absalom almost riding a souped up donkey, a hot rod donkey in a sense. But regardless, he's riding where the kings of Israel typically would have traveled on foot. And he encounters some of David's troops, and riding along, mule goes under an oak tree, a giant terebinth, and he gets caught. And the donkey just goes, the mule rather, goes right on out from under him. So now here's Absalom hung by his hair, hung by his head, presumably his hair. He's stuck in the tree. Now
He's hanging.
think about this. This is an ugly situation for him. He's caught by the head, by the hair, and he can't get down. He is utterly helpless.
Hanging by his neck.
There's no way this is comfortable. All of his weight is hanging here. And the more he moves and struggles, the worse it gets, just on a practical level. But word goes back, I saw Absalom hanging in an oak tree. And Joab's response, what? You saw him? Where? Why didn't you kill him right then? I'd have paid you 10 pieces of silver and a belt. I'd have rewarded you. Notice at verse 12, the man's reaction. Even if I felt in my hand, even if I had in my hand the weight of 1,000 pieces of silver, I would not reach out my hand against the king's son. In our hearing, the king commanded you and Abishai and Ittai, for my sake, protect the young man Absalom. On the other hand, if I had dealt treacherously against his life, in other words, if I had risked my life to kill him, you yourself, you would not say a word. You would let the penalty fall on me. And Joab basically says, I don't have time to argue with you. And took 3 darts or 3 arrows and murders Absalom right there. 10 young men, Joab's henchmen, Joab's armor bearers, they're right there around him. And Absalom is killed. Absalom is murdered. Now, the one that told him where Absalom was, so presumably so he could go and capture Absalom, had heard David's instruction. But Joab strikes him. His warriors, his armor bearers, gather around him, and they're the ones that administer the coup de grace, and he dies. Absalom is dead. Now the war is over. So Joab blew the trumpet. The troops came back from pursuing. Joab restrained them. They took Absalom, threw him in a pit in the forest, raised over him a very great heap of stones, and all Israel fled, everyone to his home. Now, they gave him a less than royal burial. They buried him before David knew what happened to him. On one level, they gave him exactly what he deserved. He did not deserve to be buried like a member of the royal family in the king's house or anything. It was a poor burial that compares to the burial of Achan. Go back to Joshua chapter 7. Israel, after Jericho, comes to Ai, and they're going to go obliterate this little town, and instead they get whipped. And Joshua has to figure out what's going on. Well, God reveals to him, Achan disobeyed, stole the devoted things, and what did they do with Achan? They stoned him and his family, and they piled up stones over him in the valley of Achor, the valley of troubling. Go over to Joshua chapter 8. What did they do with the king of Ai once they conquered Ai? They did the same thing, piled up stones over him. So Joab gives Absalom a burial that puts him in company with some wicked, evil people in Israel's past. On one level, deservedly so. But it's a violation of what David had wanted all along, which was for Absalom to be preserved alive. So, Joab rather, is intent, in one sense, on mocking Absalom by doing this. Notice at verse 18, Absalom had taken and set up for himself the pillar that is in the king's valley, for he said, I have no son to keep my name in remembrance. He called the pillar after his own name, and it's called Absalom's monument to this day. But wait a minute, back up. Absalom was not childless, was he? You go back over here to chapter 14, at verse 27, there were born to Absalom 3 sons and 1 daughter, whose name was Tamar. Why does he build this pillar here? Well, we don't know what happened to the children, for one thing. Don't have any record of his sons at this point. Evidently, the children must have died, the sons at any rate, must have died in infancy. Notice that their names are not given, but the daughter's name is given. It would seem that Absalom fathered 3 sons, but none of them survived. He fathered a daughter, and apparently she survived because she's named. Because the sons are not, what does Absalom do? He builds a monument to himself. And to that day, it's still known as Absalom's hand, Absalom's monument. Well, the rest of chapter 18 is where word comes to David of what has happened. David now is informed, number one, we won. We won the battle. Great rejoicing. Number 2, Absalom's dead. And that's not what David wanted to hear. So Ahimaaz, one of the priests, the son of Zadok, wants to carry the news to the king. And Joab is trying to prevent Ahimaaz going and telling David everything that had happened. Joab is trying to shape the message here. He wants only the good news. We won. Well, where is Absalom? Where is my son? Oh, we haven't found his body yet. Something like that. So Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok, this Levite, this priest, says, let me go take the news. No, not you. You're not to do this. You carry the news another day, but today, not you. The king's son is dead. We don't want you carrying bad news to him. And so he says to the Cushite, whoever this is, Cushi is the name given in some translations. You go, tell the king what you've seen. Now, two possibilities here. Tell the king what you have seen. Maybe Cushi, the Cushite, he may not have been there at Absalom's death, so he may not know anything about it. He knows they've won the battle. Okay, go tell the king what you know. And it may be that Joab has just conveniently omitted the information about Absalom's death. So Cushi can go and speak truthfully. We won, that's all I know. It may well be that Cushi, this individual, is in on Joab's intention, which is, you go tell him what you've seen. You go tell him what I want you to, what I want you to tell him, which is not Absalom is dead. Tell him we won. Regardless of which way that plays out, which circumstance it is, Cushi is on his way. And Ahimaaz comes back. Let me go after him. Let me follow him. Well, why will you run, my son, seeing that you have no reward for the news? You're not going to win. You're not going to be rewarded. You're not going to be. You're not going to get a prize. There's nothing in this for you to run and follow up the message with the same message. Well, come what may, I will run. I'm determined to go, in other words. A single runner, visually speaking, a single runner would seem to indicate good news. If David's forces had been defeated, he wouldn't see a single runner coming to bring him news. He'd see the remnants of them all running for their lives. And so here, Ahimaaz says, well, I'm going to run too. And Joab can't really stop him. So off he goes. And he ran by way of the plain and outran Cushi, or the Cushite. Apparently he took a different route, knew a faster way, was fleeter of foot, whatever. He got there first. And David is sitting between gates, sees the man running, and the watchman calls out, I see the man running. If he's alone, there's news in his mouth. In other words, if you see one man, well, he's bringing a message. And as they watch, here's another man running alone. He's also a messenger. They're not together. They're not fleeing. They've got news. And now the first one says, that guy looks like Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok. Something about the way he ran, something about his appearance. He was recognizable from a distance. And the king says, if it's him, that's good news for our side. Good news for our side. So Ahimaaz arrives. All is well. Things have gone well. Bowed before the king with his face to the earth. Blessed be the Lord your God, who's delivered up the men who raised their hand against my lord the king. Is it well with the young man Absalom? The king asks. And here, Ahimaaz feigns, he pretends to be ignorant about Absalom's death. When Joab sent the king's servant, your servant, I saw a great commotion, but I don't know what it was. That's not straight up honest, is it? Number one, Joab didn't send him. He went on his own. The one that Joab sent, was Cushai. And number two, Ahimaaz knew what had happened, but he just pretends that he doesn't know. The king says, you step over here and wait here. And Cushai arrives. Good news, the Lord has delivered you this day from the hand of all who rose up against you. Is it well with the young man Absalom? And Cushai says, may all the enemies of my lord the king and all who rise up against you for evil be like that young man. His message is plain. The king was deeply moved, went up to the chamber over the gate and wept. And as he went, he said, oh, my son, Absalom, my son, would to God that I had died for you. Oh, Absalom, my son, my son. He's mourning for his son. Now, in chapter 19, David is going to be restored to power. He's going to return to Jerusalem. He's going to pardon his enemies. But before all of that, as he receives the kingdom back, Joab comes on the scene. It's told to Joab, the king is weeping and mourning for Absalom. And Joab is fit to be tied over this. It's unseemly in his thinking. His perspective is Absalom was a rebel. Absalom was a murderer. Absalom got what was coming to him. And it's unseemly for the king to mourn over him. So the people stole into the city that day, verse 3, as people who steal in, who are ashamed when they, in other words, as the people come from the battle, they come quietly, sneak into the city, basically. They don't want to disturb the king. And the king is still mourning. Oh, Absalom, my son, my son. And notice Joab's words in verse 5. You have covered with shame the faces of all your servants who've saved your life and the lives of your sons and your daughters and the lives of your wives and your concubines, because you love those who hate you and hate those who love you. That's the message you're putting. You're more upset that this rebellious son is dead than you are joyful that everything else has been restored. Joab's basically saying, David, you're telling the people you wish that they were dead, the people that fought for you. You're basically telling them you wish they were dead and Absalom was still alive. Well, if that's the case, what were we fighting for? And so in verses 7 and 8, now David goes down to the gate to greet the soldiers, the army, the people, as he should have been doing. And in verses 9 and 10, they want him back as their king. All the people were arguing through all the tribes. The king delivered us from the hand of our enemies, saved us from the hand of the Philistines. He's fled out from the land of Absalom, but Absalom is dead. Why do you say nothing about bringing the king back? In other words, we need to settle this. We want the king back. We want David back as king. And so in verses 11 through 15 now, he sends word to Judah, because Absalom's rebellion started in Judah, among David's family territory in Hebron, where David had originally been crowned king. So before he's going to come back, he wants to know, are my original people, my original supporters, do they want me back? So in verses 11 through 15, he sends word. Do they support me? Yes, they do. Yes, they're on my side. Sent Zadok and Abiathar the priests to the elders of Judah. Why should you be the last to bring the king back to his house when the word of all Israel has come to the king? You're my brothers, you're my bone, you're my flesh, and so forth. So the king came back to the Jordan, verse 15, And Judah came to Gilgal to meet the king and bring the king over the Jordan. All right, now David is going to pardon his enemies. Verses 16 through 23, Shimei. Remember Shimei? The cousin of Saul, who had cursed at David and thrown stones at him and so forth. Shimei is pardoned. Hurried down to come down with the men of Judah to meet King David, with him 1,000 men from Benjamin. Ziba, the servant of the house of Saul, with his 15 sons and 20 servants, rushed over the ford to the king's household to do his pleasure. And Shimei fell down before the king and said, "Let not my lord hold me guilty, or remember how your servant did wrong. Your servant knows that I have sinned. I have come this day, the first of all the house of Joseph, to come down to meet my lord the king." And Abishai does not take kindly to his master David being misused. It was Abishai that wanted to go kill Shimei in the first place. And now he still is ready. Doesn't he deserve to be put to death because he cursed the Lord's anointed? And David says, no. We're not going to execute anybody today. This is not fitting today. I'm king. I've been reassured of that. God has reassured me by all that's happened. And so he says to Shimei, "You shall not die." And he made it official. He gave him his oath. He gave him his word. Well, now Mephibosheth. Here is Mephibosheth, and he receives only part of his inheritance back. He came down to meet the king. He had not, from the day that the king departed, he had not been taking care of himself, grooming himself, and so forth. The implication here is that he's been in mourning all this time. Certainly, he's not had the wherewithal. He's not had the servants and so forth, because what had Ziba done? Ziba had falsely accused him of celebrating David's defeat and rejoicing at David's hardships. And it turns out that was a false accusation. And so from the time that he's known that, he's not kept himself up. He's been in mourning basically for that. He came to Jerusalem to meet the king, verse 25. Why did you not go with me, Mephibosheth? And here's the explanation, verse 26. My servant deceived me. Your servant said to him, I'll saddle a donkey for myself that I may ride on it and go with the king, for your servant is lame. So in other words, Mephibosheth said, here's what I was going to do. I wanted to go with you. I can't walk, so I was going to ride. And in the meantime, Ziba got out ahead of me and slandered me. He slandered your servant to my lord the king. But verse 27, my lord the king is like the angel of God. Do therefore what seems good to you. All my father's house were but men doomed to death, but you set your servant among those who eat at your table. What further right have I then to cry to the king? In other words, you were always good to me. You know, by rights, my family should have all been condemned to death, and you spared me and you gave me a place of honor, and I do what seems right to you. And here's something that seems to be poor judgment on David's part. The solution to this, verse 29, why speak any more of your affairs? I have decided you and Ziba shall divide the land. And Mephibosheth said to the king, let him take it all, since the Lord my king has come safely home. Mephibosheth has no need of this. And it speaks volumes about his honor after he had been falsely accused by Ziba, that he would say, Your Majesty, he can have all of it. The fact that you're home safe is all that matters to me. How this worked out between the two of them, we don't know, not from this text. In the meantime, as our time is about expired, the rest of the chapter concerns Barzillai and the rebellion of Sheba in chapter 20. David's troubles are not over. We'll come back next week and talk a little bit about Barzillai and about who he is and his dealings with David. But he was an aged man, and it had been he who had fed David, provided food at Mahanaim. And we'll come back and deal with him a little bit more next week. Our time is up. Comments, questions, thoughts before we dismiss.
The time just go by too fast. But great lesson.
What did he mean by go back to 27?
Okay.
He was going to give them some land where you last closed down. He was going to, the king will, remember,
Okay, Mephibosheth is Jonathan's son.
was the son of, I know, Saul.
He's,
Jonathan.
yeah, he's Saul's
And
grandson.
The guy that kept him, the king gonna give him some land?
Okay, when David first asked about any descendants of King Saul that he could show kindness to.
Yeah, he did.
Mephibosheth is the only one left,
Right.
and he is Jonathan's son, so that's doubly a blessing for David, because
Right.
Jonathan was his best friend. He awards to Mephibosheth all of Jonathan's land and house and so forth,
Okay.
and he gives Ziba, who is the servant who had served him and watched over him and brought word to David of him, he gives Ziba the responsibility of taking care of Jonathan, of Mephibosheth.
That's the man talking about get back to.
So then when all of this comes to pass, what does Ziba do? Ziba hangs Mephibosheth out to dry and tells David, oh, he was rejoicing in your hardships, and he was expecting to have the kingship restored to Saul's house and so forth. And so David said, well, if that's how he repays me, everything that belongs to him is now yours, Ziba, because you've been my faithful servant, taking care of him. Well, come to find out here, Ziba lied. Ziba was apparently trying to take Mephibosheth's inheritance for himself.
Right.
So when Mephibosheth surfaces here and presents himself to the king, rejoicing that the king has come back, I've been your faithful servant. All that was not true. That was a lie. He lied on me, and so forth. David shows some poor judgment, seemingly, by taking Mephibosheth's inheritance and saying, okay, I'm just going to split this down the middle. Ziba gets half and you get half instead of you get all. And Mephibosheth then shows what kind of a man he is and says, the only thing that matters to me is you're safe. He can have everything. In other words, I don't need this. The only thing that matters to me is you, my father's dearest friend, and my king. You're safe. You're home. That's all that matters. Says more about Mephibosheth. It says better things about Mephibosheth than David's judgment said about himself. David's judgment doesn't, at least from our perspective, doesn't seem fair here. Doesn't seem wise. You would think he would summon Ziba back and say, you're out. Everything goes back to Mephibosheth. but for whatever reason, he didn't do that. Anyway, we'll stop here. We'll talk a little bit about Barzillai next week, and then we'll move on and wind up 2 Samuel next Tuesday night, Lord willing. And then that'll leave the last class for review for the final.
Hey, thank you. Love y'all.
Hey, thanks.
Final, what final?
Good night.
Yeah, thanks for a good class.
Good.
Y'all take care.
Thank you. Good night.